from another perspective, you can see that getting richer might also prevent conflict. Yeah? So in the words of John Maynard Keynes, economic development is a process of turning interests against passions. What does he mean by that? Well, there's a certain stage in economic development where people's integration with each other, economically speaking, outweighs their political passion to go to war with each other. Yeah? And this theory has been popularized in rather spurious associations such as MacDonald's theory of war and the most latest abomination of Thomas Friedman, the Dell supply chain theory of war, which suggests that no two companies in a countries in a multinational supply chain have ever gone to war with each other. Of course, the McDonald's one isn't true. No two countries with a McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other. Anyone want to suggest any counter examples to this? The most recent is the Russian-Georgian conflict. But anyway. But there's something in it. This has an intellectual pedigree. Keynes wasn't the first person to talk about this. Immanuel Kant was. Possibly, actually, even going back much further, actually. Aristotle probably said something similar. Usually does. So there is something of truth that economic integration makes the costs of war too high. Yeah? So you would expect that economic growth, to some extent, poverty reduction, reduce the likelihood of war. Yeah? And you can see from this analysis by Paul Collier at the World Bank, he argues that the risk of civil war goes down for a typical low-income country with sustained economic growth. Okay? So here's your evidence for poverty reduction being important to prevent war. But, of course, not all conflicted places are poor. Poverty itself may lead to a state of fatalism and a lack of revolt amongst the poor. I mean, historians have often said, you know, that conflicts often happen at times of greater economic growth when economic opportunities are increasing for people. There is evidence which also shows that conflict seems to follow sharp reductions in economic growth. So after periods of strong growth, where there's a sharp reduction, then the risk of conflict goes up. And that's because expectations have changed. Yeah? And we also know that certain types of economic growth might be actually conducive to conflict. And here's an example. Dominance of natural resources in the economy related to the risk of war. As primary commodity exports as a share of GDP go up, according to Collier, so does the risk of civil war. Yes, the diamonds, coffee, even coffee in Sierra Leone's case, coltan, and so on. So, certain types of growth may increase the risk of war. And from a broad perspective, if development is about a process of change in itself, that will bring conflict. Look at the history of Europe and nation building and growth and industrialization in Europe. It was an extremely conflictual process. So this leads some commentators to say, well, actually, war is not so much about the righteous indignation of the poor against the rich, the grievances, or alternatively, the rich people's ability to suppress the poor in situations where they can, but actually about economic interests. Conflict is about greed and seizing opportunities. Yeah. So, in the analysis of just on the term poverty, the relationships with conflict are by no means clear. Yeah? And we haven't really examined any country at all we're examining this a priori almost from theory. What about inequality? The gap between rich and poor. Not just the existence of poverty, but the gap itself. So here again, we can look at some hypothetical scenarios about the relationship. Thank you so much. And also at some empirical evidence. Okay? Now, here's the hypothetical scenarios. There's 3 graphs here. This is taken from Christopher Kramer, who's an analysis of the relationship between inequality and conflict. He says, well, you know, we can look at this in 3 ways, and it's plausible there's a relationship between inequality and conflict. Inequality is on the x-axis in each of these graphs. You can see that on the left-hand graph that the risk of conflict rises in a linear way as inequality increases. This is surely the common sense notion, isn't it? As countries get more unequal, people are more angry. Yeah? But there's another way of looking at this. As inequality increases, at least initially, the risk of conflict may go down. And that might be because, as inequality rises, there's a greater degree of social mobility, at least initially, in society. There are more opportunities. Yeah? That's plausible, isn't it? That hypothesis. At least initially. Because when inequality gets past a turning point, actually the risk of conflict might go up again, because society ossifies, stratifies again, yes? After an initial period of relative openness, positions become entrenched, yeah? And so the risk of conflict rises. That's the second hypothesis. The third hypothesis is that as inequality increases, at least initially, the risk of conflict rises, yeah? From very low incomes. Because it's shocking that inequality rises, which is the linear example again, yeah? But after a turning point, as inequality rises even further, the risk of conflict goes down, because the concentration of inequality is such that military power is concentrated in the state's hands or the hands of a rich elite, and they use that to suppress the poor. Do you see that the second and third examples are completely contradictory to each other? But they're both plausible scenarios, aren't they, on the relationship between inequality and war. All 3 are plausible. So it's difficult to know how the relationship between income inequality and conflict will play out in any given society at any given time. And you can find all kinds of evidence to support all 3 hypotheses. But I think that the basic point is that inequality is so badly measured, usually through the Gini coefficient, that actually most of the data sets looking at the relationship between inequality and conflict produce spurious results. And the conclusion that Kramer comes to is that historically income inequalities vary little within countries, yet violent conflict and political violence appears to fluctuate more widely. So there must be something else, yeah, going on. And I would say it's still related to inequalities. And I follow the work of Frances Stewart. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her. She's a British economist who talks not about income inequalities, what she calls vertical inequalities. You line up all of the individuals in a population from richest to poorest, yes? We're talking about individuals.